Michael Boyle's StrengthCoach.com presents the Strength Coach Podcast, brought to you by Perform Better, the experts in functional training and rehabilitation. PerformBetter.com.
Hey everybody, welcome to a special series of the Strength Coach Podcast. I'm Anthony Renna. This is Racism in Fitness. What can we do better? A 6-part series. With the recent events, including the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and now Rayshard Brooks, I wanted to try and do something that was more than just posting a black square on social media to show that I believe Black Lives Matters, and to help my listeners and me understand some of the black experience in fitness. These events made me take a look at my own actions and probably more importantly, my non-actions. So I'm trying to do what I can to be an anti-racist, and I'm educating myself, listening to books, watching some documentaries, and having some conversations. So admittedly, I've done a horrible job including black voices on the podcast. So that's one thing I aim to change with future shows, is to having a better representation of black strength coaches on the show. So with this series, what I'm aiming to do is just start a conversation about racism in the fitness industry with some folks from diverse positions within the profession. So that's including high-level corporate positions, trainers, physical therapists, and strength coaches. I'm just trying to listen. I'm just trying to learn and use my platform to help people understand a little bit better. Each episode will have a sponsor that will be donating $250 to the organization of choice for that episode's guest. I will also be donating $50 each episode, and I want to encourage you to donate as well. And I'll have all the links to the organizations at continuefit.com in the show notes for each episode, so you can discover more on your own. Today I have on David Harris, David formerly of Equinox, at a high level. And the organization he's chosen is the It Gets Better Project. Today's sponsor is Victor and Betty Gerstein, so thank you so much for your generous donation. All right, lots of things to get to, so let's get on the phone with David Harris. All right, today's guest is David Harris, and David is a 35-year industry veteran and former Vice President of Health and Human Performance, Chairman of the Equinox Health Advisory Board, and Vice President of Personal Training for Equinox. Over the course of a career that spanned that of a personal trainer to the company's senior most executive and foremost authority on the personal training business and trainer education, David built what is arguably the best and most successful personal training enterprise in the world. I can attest that I worked at Equinox while he was there, and it's actually why I wanted to work for Equinox, because I knew of the reputation for education and their personal training expertise. He's also responsible for laying the groundwork for the company's current platform of holistic health, best represented by a focus on movement, nutrition, and regeneration, in addition to best-in-class personal training. He's also spearheaded the company's commitment to evidence-based research, solidifying a 10-year-long relationship with the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA, resulting in 3 published clinical studies that validated the company's approach to health and wellness. This approach informed the scientific basis behind the company's recent foray into hotels, with a focus on enhanced sleep quality and regenerative experiences. He's currently president of Authenticite, an LLC working in collaboration with Simon Sinek Incorporated. You know Simon from Start With Why fame. And he's doing that to curate online educational experiences and public speaking events focused on team-based and executive leadership and collaboration. David, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you, Anthony. It's great to be here.
All right. I'm going to tell everybody about the link to your Instagram account as well, because I really think if you want a great, almost like cheat notes into Black history, David's Instagram is fascinating. And I'll give you an example. Go back to February. He did a whole thing every day on lynching. And some of it is hard to read and look at, but it's really important. He does an amazing job of keeping a commitment to educating people about some of the injustices of and what's going on with what's happening today. And that's JLG2, spell it out, JLG2 on Instagram. And we're going to have a link to that. So I just wanted to mention that, David, because I do love your Instagram, even your pictures that we were talking earlier about, the New York City one. So you do a great job on Instagram.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, David, Ibram Kendi, I heard he was on a show he's the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, and he was on a show with Oprah. And she asked him how he felt, and he said he's both enraged and energized right now. Enraged because he's a human being and a black human being, seeing, people are dead because of the color of their skin. But he said he's also alive, being fueled by the resistance. And people are declaring that Black Lives Matter and seeking to push for transformative policy change so that Black lives can be protected. So I wanted to start out with how are you doing through all of this? I know how passionate you are, and obviously I just want to check in with you. How are you doing?
Well, thank you for asking, Anthony. For me as an African American, it's just another day at the office, right? African Americans have been going through this for centuries and decades. It's just the recent events of the last couple of months with Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd, all clustered so close together and during a pandemic, I think really highlighted how this is really reaching critical mass. And, I think in the case of George Floyd with that videotaping of the incident itself and the 9 minutes with which Derek Chauvin pressed his knee into George Floyd's neck, that will be decades from now, the equivalent of Rosa Parks on the back of that bus, right? A very, very powerful historical moment where people really saw firsthand, the injustice of an experience, and not just to a black person, to any person. No person should be subjected to that kind of treatment. But yet it is part of a historical pattern of mistreatment of African Americans at the hands of the police and other supposed authorities. And it fits tragically a pattern that has gone on for decades and centuries. And, it's very interesting you mentioned my Instagram because I began that initially, that initiative for what some people call Black History Month, but I call American History Month. Because Black history and American history are the same thing. But I did it in recognition of a month that has historically highlighted African American achievement. And I wanted to highlight stories that I felt had not been brought to light in the past. They are not taught as part of standard history lessons. And I was very inspired by the idea that so many people lost their lives in the 20th century and in the late 19th century as a result of lynching. And then, its variants throughout the 20th century through Jim Crow. So many stories that were lost that are there if we choose to find them. So each day I wanted to highlight an individual who had suffered the consequences of this mistreatment. And at the time that I started posting, I actually had a couple people reach out to me and say, why are you doing this in the middle of a pandemic? It's just so negative, and I know it's important, but. And then we had the events which happened. And to me, that was kind of poetic in a way because no time is ever the right time to talk about social injustice, and yet it is always the right time to talk about social injustice. The question is, how do we do it? Who is made uncomfortable by it, and how do we engage in constructive dialogue to actually bring about change?
Excellent. Yeah, and it's so sad. Actually, the opening statement, it's just another day at the office. And that just really is such a sad statement onto, how long this has obviously been going on for 400 years and just really how sad for when I hear that coming out of your voice, that this is just, it's almost like, well, okay, just, it's almost not expected, but you're not so surprised by it. None of us are anymore at this point. I think it's just it's out there. So it's a really sad statement. But I want to ask you, speaking of The Office, since this is the Strength Coach podcast, and I wanted to tailor this towards the fitness profession, and you were the first one that I thought of when I thought of doing this, because I knew your background, obviously, and I knew your just your expansive resume, and ending up at a high level in corporate fitness at Equinox, and I figured that you really had one of the greatest perspective from the 35,000 foot view as well. So I wanted to talk about how racism has impacted you specifically in the fitness profession.
Well, it's interesting. I always approached my work, no matter what it was. I went in to do the best job that I could as an employee first. My identity as a Black person is obvious to all, and I felt like that in itself was enough of a statement. I didn't, need to stress that. However, I think much as in the rest of society, we can't separate the fitness industry out of the rest of society and say, oh, it doesn't operate that way. It's the same people in normal society as it would be in the fitness industry. Everybody brings their cultural perspectives and biases and attitudes to the places that they work. Fortunately, at Equinox, I was able to, work with the original owners who founded the company, and I believe they had an incredibly diverse workforce. At the start, it was a very, I never felt a sense of bias at the time that I started back in the 1990s. I was uploaded into that system as a personal trainer, just as personal trainers are today. I went through EFTI, I picked up towels and water bottles, I spotted people, I did Equifits, I did everything that, one would expect to do to become successful at being a personal trainer. And I did not have my eyes on being a director or a vice president or all of that stuff came later. It was more about, delivering results to the clients and being the best that I could at my craft. And so that's what I focused on. And, I can't say, definitively how my race played a role in that scenario as a trainer. I wasn't really cognizant of it. I know that, the common myth of the muscular Black male is that he's an athlete and, he must know what he's doing, and people who are athletic, be they white, Black, gray, or green, they all get that stereotype. If you have a physical presence, people want to work with you because it's inspirational. And it's not, necessarily being about, the best physique or the best looking person. It's always about, do you possess the characteristics that will inspire? And I think that's something that cuts across the color spectrum. So when I started at Equinox, there were really incredibly successful white trainers and Black trainers. And I think the original owners, cultivated an environment where diversity was really a calling card. And so I felt at the time very welcomed in that environment. I knew I had to work hard to make my way and to pick up clients, and eventually I got into management. But so that was my early experience there.
So were you in? I know the original location is in Scarsdale, and then they moved to the second location, or one. I'm assuming I think was on Amsterdam Avenue, right? Am I correct in that? Were you the city, or were you up in Scarsdale?
Well, actually, just a bit of a course correction. The first Equinox was actually in New York City on Amsterdam and 76. The name of the club was Westchester Health and Fitness. So when they moved to New York City, they had a different name. And so, I was working out at World Gym at the time back in 1991, and I was walking. At the time, I lived on the Upper West Side, and I was walking up Amsterdam Avenue, and I saw this building wrapped up like some kind of a package, right? Like some kind of a birthday or Christmas package. And, it said, opening September 21st, 1991 at 2:05 or whatever the time was. And, I immediately keyed in on the idea that this was kind of an astrological association because of the date and because it was the autumnal equinox. So I knew that there was something going on there with that. So that was the first one. However, I did not get hired into working there until 1994. And so, it had been open for a couple of years by the time I got there.
Okay, yeah, because I'm confusing it because of the name, Westchester Health and Fitness. So I was assuming, because I did work at Scarsdale location. So I was going to ask you, with the demographic there, really, you didn't see any people of color that were members there. It was the percentage was extremely low. And I wanted to see if you felt like that impacted your experience there as well.
Well, I wasn't at Westchester Health and Fitness, so I can't say. I was on the Upper West Side at the 76 in Amsterdam, Equinox, which did not have an enormous amount of black clientele either at the time. But there were people of color. There were a lot of trainers of color. There were instructors. There were group fitness instructors. I mean, I remember it being, a very diverse palette. Where I really encountered, a significant difference was when I went over to the east side of Manhattan. And I worked first at 85th and 3rd at Equinox and then at the 63rd in Lexington. Those were very culturally different. As you know, New York is a very diverse city, but every neighborhood is really like its own culture. And you don't really understand that until you live here, that the Upper East Side is as different from the Upper West Side as the Upper West Side is from the Village, and so on and so forth. So going to the East Side was, a bit of a not surprising to me because I knew that culture fairly well. And I think a lot of this stems from, my having to have been, integrated with white people from a very young age. When I was 9 years old, or 8 or 9 years old in the late 1960s, I had to go to an all-white Catholic grade school where I was called racial epithets and all kinds of things. And it was a very tense time. 1968 was a rather epochal year in United States history and a very tense time racially. So, those formative experiences prepared me for being the only one in the room, which I've largely been throughout a lot of my life. And so going to the east side of Manhattan was really no different. But it was when I went to the 63rd and Lexington location that, I did encounter some direct racist treatment, not from my employers, but from some of the members who were not very kindly disposed to me. And, that gets communicated in a variety of ways. But, I'll give you one example. There was one very direct situation where I had to go into a sales advisor's office to sell personal training. And there was a woman, I was working with the sales advisor, as was my habit, to sell personal training. And I went in to interview her just as I would anyone else. And one of the questions I always ask is, what are the considerations? What kind of person do you feel comfortable with? Training is first above and beyond. It is a social experience. So you want to create the right social environment for the trainer and the member. And I had asked her, were there any considerations? And she looked me dead in the eye and she said, I don't want a black trainer. And I just took it in stride. I took notes and I asked her, other questions about what she wanted, but she obviously had racial hostility. And once I placed her with her trainer was really upset by her attitude, and her trainer was white and was really bothered by, the fact that she was so outspokenly racist. So, these situations occur. And there are things that, we African Americans have had to cut our teeth on for years.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. David, what about, again, you went from trainer into corporate, like being a director and being a VP. I want to talk about listening to Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. He talks a lot about policy, and that's what needs to change. Has there been some racist policy that you've seen, not only at Equinox, I know because you were helping to probably change that policy and what you were doing, but in the fitness industry that maybe have held your career back a little bit?
I was never spoken to in a racially hostile way. I never felt like it was a hostile environment racially. I think Equinox has always prided itself on embracing diversity. I think that is true. I think that, the issue of race and racial assumptions are things that, however, that we always have to query ourselves on and ask ourselves questions about, just as we do about gender and sexual persuasion and a variety of other things. And, in my life, I've had to encounter a lot of different types of people. However, there are people who maybe have not encountered a lot of people like me. Some people may have assumptions that they understand Black culture, whatever that is. And, I have worked with people, laterally to me who, could say things that one could conjecture would be offensive. And I really don't take these things as being a direct attempt to be racist toward me. I think it's very important that we remember that, the plight of African Americans has never been as visible to white America as it is today as a result of this George Floyd thing. And a lot of that I credit to technology and, the fact that so much was made evident. That said, I think when people make comments or insensitive or joke in an insensitive manner, this comes from more of an ignorance of the diversity of the Black experience than it does from an attempt to be, offensive. And so I think the best thing that we can do in such circumstances is to challenge people in ways that, sort of get at some of those assumptions. And I think it's always best to have people introspect on their attitudes. And I think that there's a way of going about doing that through dialogue. That periodically would happen with colleagues.
When you say that, though, what are some other, like a lot of people talk about educating yourself with this. So I've tried to do that now to make myself better. I feel like it starts with you. Everybody should find out what they can do better, admit it first, have an awareness, and then start to educate. So I've done that through audiobooks and through Netflix, some movies, and some webinars, and I'm trying to do it through this series as well. Sometimes I use the podcast selfishly to learn. And then at the same time, be able to get the word out there and give people a platform. And I'll give you an example. I need to find more Black voices for the show besides this series. People that are working in the industry, and I don't do a good enough job. I don't do a good enough job with females, and I don't do a good enough job with Black voices. So that's something that I'm really looking at myself and trying to understand and work on now. Besides, again, just this policy. I don't want to just this series. I don't want to just have this series and then be like, forget about it, which I think a lot of people will do. So talk to us. What are some other things that you feel like would you recommend, like that some people, how to educate themselves with some of this stuff?
I've been asked that question by a few people, and particularly by my white friends and white people who I think are very well-meaning in wanting to understand this dynamic more so that there can be a more of a collective course correction. And I tell them that, I appreciate their asking me, but really what they need to do is they need to talk more to white people, their white friends, white family members, people in their community. A lot of these attitudes, racial attitudes or perceptions that people may have of a particular group are if you really dig underneath them, they really come from a lack of exposure, a lack of sustained exposure to people who are different from themselves. And, I think I told you very early on, I had to get used to being around people who were very different from me. And I wouldn't trade that experience for the world, because I think it's allowed me to have the views that I have. And it's made me much more receptive and open to difference. People, however, who have grown up in a much more kind of homogenous environment, who have never really had to be different or the one to adapt or the one to try to listen and understand, or even to fit in, if that's the case. They've never had to make those kinds of adjustments and negotiate difficult territory like that. So what I tell my white friends is, you're around people all the time who may be very direct and open about racial attitudes they may have. They may be very hostile racially. And I think it's incumbent upon them to call that out with their friends. It's not so much about walking down Fifth Avenue and, carrying a placard and shouting Black Lives Matter. It's about personal accountability toward attitude. And I think it's about really being willing to acknowledge what you don't know. If you don't know something about a culture or a people, find out about it. Go in, have an experience, put yourself in an environment where you're the only one in the room. Try to reach out to people who are different from you. These are the ways that you can really make a measurable impact by expanding your presence in the world with people who may be different from you. And I say that as much to African Americans as I do to anyone. It's very important to not always be with people who are the same as you.
Excellent answer. I haven't heard that yet. To be honest with you, it's really, I get it. Talking to your white friends and your family members and the people that you're around the most, and making sure that you do call it out. Because I've seen it a lot too, with some people kind of understanding now about white privilege, people that were offended by that term at one point, but now are starting to understand it, seeing this all over and understanding that definition. So
yeah, and I think if I could just, this thing on privilege, which is always batted around, I think it gets at something very, very fundamental that most white people have not had to consider that a Black person does every single day. And that is, you can walk into the world and never have to think about your color. You never have to once think about, if I walk out onto Fifth Avenue and I raise my hand to get that taxi, will it stop for me? The assumption is that it will always stop for you. Mm. We, on the other hand, have to always consider that it may not. We have to consider that if we go into a store, we may be followed. We have to consider that we may be profiled in some other way that's very unflattering based on whatever assumptions people are carrying. So it's really about the privilege to move about in the world without assumption. And that is something that many white people have that African Americans do not have. And so that in itself is a privilege that I'm afraid many take for granted.
Absolutely. I, for one, have taken that. It reminds me of when I first heard from the Girls Going Strong team about a rape schedule. And what they were talking about is women live on this, what they call like a rape schedule, almost like where, okay, I can't walk past this way. I can't go here after a certain time. And that started me to really understand. And then hearing about, like you said, living in New York and never having to worry about that with a taxi or going into a store, never having that assumption. So it's an important piece, and people need to let their guard down to really understand that. So, David, you posted today a great quote by Buckminster Fuller. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And that leads me into my kind of last question with what can the profession, what can we do? What can the Fit Pros do better? What can we do to help, if we have to break it down, but to help build a new model to overcome racism, whatever we have in the industry?
Well, I think one is being able to identify where it exists, when it exists. And in the fitness industry, it exists in more subtle ways. It's not necessarily open racism. It can be more covert. It can be through the way clubs market product. I, for one, I've been in this industry for a very long time, and I see a lot more African American and cross-cultural representation in advertisements across the board than existed 35 years ago. That is for sure. So I think that there has been progress in terms of kind of imagistic representation of diversity in the industry. That said, I think we all need to do a better job at just really understanding and being sensitive to when we are in positions where we don't know something. And that can be the staff that we have that may be impacted negatively by a certain event or circumstance. I think we have to cultivate better ears for listening. And I think we have to, in New York City, it's very easy to talk about representation through diversity because it's a very diverse city, as is Los Angeles. Any of the big markets are like that. But when you go into some outer markets, they're much more homogenous, and they will represent by virtue of who their clientele is. I think it would be useful sometimes to sort of break away from that and, have more diversity in representation, either with people who are working there or with, the way that things are represented through marketing campaigns or whatnot. It's not always about someone who looks like me or someone who I would aspire to be. It's, does that person have the character? Do they have the energy? Do they exhibit the characteristics that I would aspire to be? And I can tell you right now, there are so many people of different races and different sexual persuasions and different genders that I admire, who I try to emulate and I base my character on. So to me, I think being aware that there's a wide range in the palette to draw from can really help to change this in very subtle ways.
Love it. David, each episode we are doing, before I get to your closing thoughts, but each episode I got sponsors to donate $250 to the guests organization of their choice. And you picked It Gets Better Project. And I just wanted you to talk about that. So they're going to donate $250. I'm going to donate $50 myself, $50 in each episode. And what I'd like, hopefully get some people to donate as well. We're going to have links to it. So tell us a little bit about that organization before we get to your closing thoughts.
It Gets Better is a organization dedicated to LGBTQ youth in helping them find a safe place to voice who they are. And it's very much a support organization for people who have been locked out, either from their families, to express who they are, to express their sexual identity, and to live that with courage. And to be in an educated environment where they can learn how to be responsible in the world. And so I'm very much about making sure that young people who are LGBTQ are living in a world where they can claim who they are from a very young age and live that with authority and with a certain sense of responsibility to others in a supportive environment. And so I'm very supportive of It Gets Better.
All right. I will remind everybody we're going to have a link to that. So hopefully you will donate to that. So thank you to the Gersteins for providing that money for the show today. David, I want to give you an opportunity to have some closing thoughts on this whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, my closing thoughts are that this is obviously a very challenging time, but it's also a very exciting time. And I think, I'm so heartened by what I've seen in the streets of the young people protesting. The diversity that is out there saying enough is enough is so inspiring. And I think, it's true what they say, our future rests in the hands of the young, and as it should be, because they are cultivating their future and they imagine a different world where this is not an issue. And so I think as leaders, as perhaps older leaders who are working with young people, it is up to us to cultivate an environment where they can thrive and, find that self-expression and that acceptance, and give them the building blocks to create the world that will be in the future and that will serve future generations.
Love it. David, thank you so much for kicking this series off. Racism in Fitness, What Can We Do Better? We really appreciate it. You're the first one I thought of when I thought of doing this. I really appreciate your perspective. So again, thank you so much for coming on.
You're welcome, Anthony. Thank you for having me.
All right, well, that's going to do it for part 1 of Racism in Fitness. What can we do better? This is a 6-part series, don't forget. Thanks so much to David Harris for coming on and giving us his perspective and experience on racism in the fitness industry. Thanks to Victor and Biddy Gerstein for their generous donation to David's organization of choice, the It Gets Better Project. I'll have links at continuefit.com to find out more and to donate yourself. Next episode, I speak with Dr. Jennifer Hutton, a pediatric physical therapist, and we're going to focus on allyship and some of the things I learned in her webinar. So don't miss it. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you'll join me next time.